Welcome to a special edition of the Art Review. As we celebrate the Platinum Jubilee, we'll be looking at how the Queen's reign has been captured on canvas through hundreds of portraits created during her 70 years on the throne. We'll be at the Mall Galleries for a special royal exhibition. But first, I caught up with the National Portrait Gallery's Chief Curator, Alison Smith, to find out more about the history of royal portraits and how Her Majesty has contributed to that tradition.
Royal portraiture is so important throughout history because it really helps establish the image of the monarch. It's to do with image coining, really. So people, the subjects, further afield, they can recognise who the monarch, the head of state, is. So it's partly to do with a likeness, but over and above that, the royal is a symbol. They embody certain values. It's to do with continuity, stability. They embody the moral tenor, the moral values of the nation. They often set a moral example too. So it's the individual and what the individual represents.
So, responsible for the National Portrait Collection as the Chief Curator, how far back did the royal portraits go and how have they evolved so dramatically?
Well, the earliest royal portrait we have in our collection is of Henry VII, although we have later representations of some of the Plantagenet kings, but they go from the Plantagenets all the way up to the present day. And because the Queen is the longest serving monarch in British history, we have more representations of her than any other monarch, about 900 in total, and rising, you could say.
And so how have they evolved over time? Because we all know about the history and about the symbols and their power and their divine right. How has that evolved so dramatically?
It's really a story of sort of continuity and change. So if you look back to some of the early portraits, they tend to be quite schematic and quite iconic. When I say iconic, like a religious icon. So it's more what the person symbolises than who they are as a particular person. But if you go back to the Tudor portraits, for example, and think of Henry VIII or his daughter Elizabeth I, those portraits tend to communicate power, absolute power, because the monarch had power at that particular time. So Henry VIII looks like a thug, you might say, often padded out to convey the idea of bulk. And in the famous Whitehall cartoon, his feet are implanted firmly on the floor, as if he's a sort of an oak tree, really. The idea that I am here and my dynasty is here to stay. In fact, his dynasty wasn't at all secure, hence his need for a son. Then when Elizabeth takes over, she becomes the Virgin Queen, and a lot of the royal portraits of her were commissioned by favourites, by sort of courtiers who wanted to curry favour with her. But the Queen, like Henry, was very skillful in sort of manipulating her image, or sort of, fashioning an image, which is often to do with artifice and remoteness. So she often appears frozen, like an ice queen, with this white face, bedecked with jewels, with pearls, again the heavy padding and embroidery, which all conveys an idea of someone from another planet. And indeed, in the famous Ditchley portrait in the MPG collection, she's standing, like Henry, her feet firmly implanted in England, on Oxfordshire, in this particular case. But the idea, she is the bringer of light to the British Isles. Clouds open and then the Queen descends, almost like a goddess. So it's someone incredibly remote and powerful. And the idea is these portraits would inspire awe and submission in the viewer. As you move on through time, the portraits are grand and idealised, but the nearer you come to the present day, and particularly with the emergence of the idea of the constitutional monarch, they become more like real human beings. And the emphasis is perhaps more on their moral values, the sense of responsibility, dignity and duty. This idea of duty comes to the fore the more you come closer to the present day. And I guess the 19th century is a very interesting turning point, because that's when you have the introduction of photography. The idea, photography conveys the idea of a likeness, and then the monarch becomes one of us. But at the same time, again, the images are still very contrived to create this idea of someone who's like us, but different. They have this responsibility imposed upon them. They have a sort of duty to fulfill, so they're still remote.
Well, it was like Queen Victoria was the first one to introduce photography about the family and the sense of monarchy. Was that not so?
That's right. I think domesticity comes into it a lot, particularly this is one of the problems of being a female monarch. I mean, if you think of Victoria, this was a time when there was this doctrine of separate spheres, man for the field and woman for the home. And yet, as the Queen, later, the Empress of India, and overseeing this vast empire, she had this sort of, huge international role, which she had to marry with her domestic role as being a wife and a mother. So not of the portraits she is shown as being a maternal figure for her own family, and then a widow, but also she becomes a mother to the world, to the empire. She becomes this imperial mother figure. So she has to sort of, shift between these different roles.
And of course, in the early times, they would have their court painters, like in Charles I or Henry VIII, like you were saying about Elizabeth, etc. Famous monarchs around the world kept their court painters, but it's completely different today.
Yes, and I think photography, there's no need for, a court painter or, the Queen, King or Queen's favourite painters, Van Dyck or Holbein, for instance. And now many artists represent the Queen. Photographers like Annie Leibovitz, Chris Levine, Thomas Struth, but also a whole host of different painters, such as represented in the exhibition at the Mall at the moment. And so you can see, it's quite interesting seeing these portraits and how the image of the Queen has shifted from the time of her coronation in 1952 all the way through to the present day. And how they've shifted, and at the same time, they've remained pretty much the same. There's quite a lot of control and behind-the-scenes work going on in the way the Queen presents herself. So the painters have to go through intermediaries. There's a discussion about the setting, which drawing room or it's going to be presented in, how long the Queen will sit for, how many sittings she will give to the artist, and for how long. So it's very carefully sort of mediated and controlled. And I think you can see a strong sense of continuity. And in fact, painters are given a certain amount of freedom, but not much. Maybe it's because the iconography surrounding the monarch is so set. So you think of the early images of the Queen, which is the fairy tale Queen. So the artists, the photographers, think of Cecil Beaton, they're quoting from the Elizabethan age.
Well, she was presented like a movie star at first.
She was, and also I think, remember, she was 25 when she came to the throne. Elizabeth I was 25 when she came to the throne. So obviously they wanted to draw those parallels with the artifice, the jewellery, the fantastic, glamorous costumes, the lighting, this otherworldly aspect. And then you could perhaps say from that point on, the Queen comes more and more down to earth.
Yes, it's evolved, it's more accessible now, and it's less deferential to members of the royal family nowadays compared to what it was 70 years ago.
Yes, I think you think of other royals that you get a rise of celebrity culture, more snapshots, informal moments. But I think the Queen, who's obviously quite, obviously been very skilled at sort of negotiating her image. There's always this sense of distance and reserve. It's just slightly inaccessible. I think when you look at images of the Queen, it's still quite difficult to sort of, penetrate behind the mask because she's been trained to project this public persona.
Which resonate with you? Which portraits of Her Majesty resonate with you?
I think apart from the wonderful Beaton photographs, the portrait which really resonates with me is the Annigoni portrait of 1969, which was commissioned for the National Portrait Gallery, because that's just so different from the others. Annigoni did an earlier portrait of the Queen for the Worship of a Company of Fishmongers, where it's more in this sort of fairy tale format with this wonderful whimsical background.
The film star look.
Film star look.
Yes.
But the one he painted in 1969 is large, and the Queen is shown isolated against this very stark background. The background looks like a sort of Rothko painting, so it sort of, communicates this sense of desolation. And she's standing in bright red in the garments which are the order of the British Empire in front of this stark bare background. It's quite interesting relating the dress and the background to the time when it was painted, because this came fast upon Harold Macmillan's famous speech he gave in the early 60s about the wind of change blowing through the British Empire, heralding the contraction of the British Empire and the loss of the former colonies. And the Queen is standing there in these robes signalling the British Empire, but at the same time sort of saying, it's all disintegrating around me, but here am I, solid as an oak, composed, solemn, committed and dedicated as ever. And she's looking away from this desolate background towards the future with this, not necessarily confident, but this sense of commitment. And I think that's the thing of duty and commitment. I'm in this role and I'm going to see it through. So it's a very brave painting, and it's sort of a brave statement for the monarch at this particular time.
Well, do you know where I was taken so much with? We all remember, we can see it in our minds now, is that when she ascended the throne, she spoke over the radio about dedicating her life not only to the United Kingdom but to the Commonwealth.
Yes.
Now, as a child of the Commonwealth, the Queen was our rallying point. In every war, in her reign, the Commonwealth would fight alongside it in the UK. And so it's just not for the UK, but it's worldwide. And what you were talking about, that painting, that signifies that, which I find quite extraordinary.
Yes, and it's sort of a universality about it. And I think that sort of starts with the background, without the usual accoutrements of a monarchy, apart from the costume she's wearing, really conveys that. And so I think it's a really important portrait in the whole of the Queen's career.
And I think it's a wonderful painting because we're celebrating. It's 70 years that she has been on the throne, and it's more than any other British monarch. And it's a tremendous thing to do, is to come and celebrate that. And you see these paintings, that's why we feel they're so important.
It's wonderful, it's almost to line them up from 1952 through to the present day to see how the image has evolved, yet at the same time it is the same person abiding by the same values. So there's a standardisation about these images, but at the same time they do, if you should look at them one to the other, they give you an idea of how the Queen has evolved over time.
Alison Smith there. Well, to see some of the portraits of the Queen and to meet some who have been honoured with permission to paint her, I've been at the Royal Society of Portrait Painters exhibition at the Mall Galleries.
I've had the great pleasure of painting Her Majesty 5 times. One was a big full-length one, and then 2 commissions came up to paint her simultaneously. And also, at that time, there were 2 other requests for her to sit. So actually I was painting about 4 of her at the same time. Different dresses, different background. And it was quite amusing, really. It was sort of, which dress am I in today? The one behind me for the Rifles Regiment just came out of the blue. I have a tendency to paint the human being, if I can. And, I often say, the robes go on afterwards. The human being is there. I mean, mine is a reasonably informal one, with a formal background. She's sitting there looking, I hope, like I've painted her. That is the Queen. I haven't inserted anything. I have made a statement about the woman sitting there.
So we're standing in front of my portrait of the Queen here, which was commissioned for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in 2019. And it came on the back of me winning the BP Portrait Award the previous year, which sort of put me in the frame. So when I got the email, I sort of had to read it about 5 times, really, and there's always an element of, obviously it's a great honour to be considered and asked to paint a monarch. But also there's a great deal of trepidation and fear around the whole process, because not every portrait of the Queen is greeted by the critics successfully. You know, it can be a little bit of a poison chalice for an artist, and I think you're very aware of that from the offset. But at the same time, it's probably a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for most artists. So of course you say yes, but you say yes, you know, with a bag full of mixed emotions, really, about the whole process.
My commission to paint the Queen came about through a prize that was sponsored by the Royal Society of Portrait Painters. And it was in, I think, 1995, and I'd entered the exhibition, the open submission, and just to get something exhibited, really. But in that year, it was not only a cash prize, which it is now, it was also a prize to paint somebody from public life. And the identity of the sitter was kept secret, right up until the moment I got the phone call from the then president, Daphne Todd. And she phoned me at home. I had no idea, you know, I was just happy to get into the show. It was pretty amazing. My first sitting was the worst, I think, for me, because I hadn't met the Queen. I hadn't even been briefed on how to meet her or what the etiquette was. And I'd actually become quite ill a few days before. I'd picked up some kind of food poisoning, but I had to go through with it because it was, you know, you can't really counsel the Queen. She was also a bit of a moving target. She didn't really sit that still. So, and I wasn't really sure what I could say, you know. So I actually asked Robert Fellows, the then private secretary, if I could ask the Queen to sit still. And he said, yeah, well, you're the boss, you know, you go ahead and tell her. And so I did. I plucked up courage and I said, Mom, could you just stay still for just a few minutes while I just work on one aspect of your face? And but then again, she was off. A few minutes later, and I think I only had one chance to do that. So that was my impression anyway.
The Queen was already she was 93, 94 years old when I was commissioned to paint this portrait. And then by the time, and they were really cutting back on sittings at that stage. So I had been told by her diaries that I might only get one sitting. And then I begged for a second sitting, which I eventually got. There was a 7-month wait between the first and the second sitting. And the second sitting happened literally, I think, about a week before we all went into lockdown. So COVID was just kind of beginning to unfold around the world. So the rest of the painting process was finished in lockdown. And maybe people were just desperate for good news because the whole world had been in lockdown. This footage just went all over the world in a way that I hadn't envisaged at all. So suddenly, yeah, I was just sort of contacted by media from all over the world. And I think actually that was when I realized what a truly global person she is, you know, that she's actually, the entire world is fascinated by Queen Elizabeth II. She's really probably the most famous person in the world. I think that's when the penny dropped, actually, for me. So that was all very extraordinary, you know, and yeah, I just got media attention from everywhere.
Of course, when you get a commission to paint any of the royals, just commercially, of course, prestige, and you can fool a lot of the public a lot of the time. I mean, you're no better a painter the day after you've painted the royals than you were before. Yes, it's very good for the career, and you get the title Royal Portrait Painter and all this sort of thing, yes. You mustn't let that affect you.
And it's 25 years since I painted that, and I feel now that I'm part of that kind of lineage going right back, you know, to Van Dyck and Holbein. I don't think I'm on their kind of level, but I'm part of that, and it's that whole historical kind of process and history of painting, really, which I'm quite proud of, really, in a way. It's something that's really very significant.
It's just an extraordinary honour, really, and privilege to be asked to paint a monarch in the first place, but also to realise that you are part of this continuity of art history. And again, that dawned on me during my first sitting, actually. I thought, my gosh, this is what artists have been doing for hundreds of years. And that's quite a thought and quite a sense of responsibility, really, that you take to your task.
The Royal Society of Portrait Painters exhibition is on at the Mall Galleries until the 14th of May. That's all for this special edition of the Art Review.